Good evening. Welcome to another episode of the Perceptive podcast series here on Game Wisdom, where we examine the art and science of games. My guest tonight is a local developer here who recently put out the Bullet Heaven VS, like however you want to call it, Fish Fear Me. And they are on to chat about it and any other Bullet Heaven related discussions we have. So please welcome to the podcast, Heather Flowers. How are you doing?
Oh, I'm doing good today. How are you?
I am doing great, besides garage door openings, allergies flaring up, and this summer-winter weather we're having here right now.
Mm.
But it's great to chat with you, and thanks for reaching out about coming on to this podcast series. For those of you listening, I'm always looking for developers to come on and chat about their games and game dev, so please do not hesitate to get in touch. So, we are recording this just about a week after, or a little bit more than that, of Next Fest February 2025. So to get things started with, Heather, how was Next Fest for you and Fish Fear Me?
So this is actually a really interesting topic. I did Next Fest for Fish Fear Me last October. As you know, you can only do Next Fest once, which meant that first off, it meant that I couldn't do it again. But second off, I ended up pushing the game out the door right before Next Fest began, like the full paid version. My logic essentially being this was the time when it was going to be released, and I figured I wouldn't have much competition for when that happened. As a result, it turned out to be decently true. I was able to stick around on the new and trending page for most of Next Fest, a full 6 days. I launched the Friday before Next Fest, which, yeah. Overall, I'd say, Next Fest was pretty great. I loved a lot of the games that people were putting out. I really enjoyed Wanderstop and Skin Deep, but, who didn't?
For sure, there's been a lot of them, and for those of you listening/watching to us right now, hopefully by the time this podcast goes up, I will finish my February Next Fest series. Because I'm up to, I think, like parts 10 or 11 that I've recorded so far. So there's been a lot of really great games. And it's interesting to hear that Fish for Me stayed up on the new and trending for so long, because obviously it's one of the biggest challenges that we've seen, especially like the last 5 years, has just been so many games flooding Steam day by day.
Yeah, I mean, it's absolutely true that there's a gigantic number of games that are being put out on Steam. And the truth is, you really do need a very strong marketing plan if you're going to get something out the door that actually gets seen. I see so many independent developers who are absolutely amazing game developers, like really good products. I hate using the word products, but you know what I mean. But who just refuse to do any marketing because they think that the game speaks for them. But the truth of the matter is, you have to be your game's biggest advocate, right? If you don't say anything about your game, nobody else will. You have to be the person who is constantly shouting about it, constantly getting it in front of people, or they will just never see it. They'll never see the wonderful thing that you made.
Oh, yes. And again, you're speaking to someone who's been covering the indie space for now over a decade, so that is very much rings true for me, especially with all the store pages I reviewed and all the developers I've watched over the 2010s that have had one game come out and then the studio closes maybe a year or two later.
Yeah.
It's, again, we are in 2025 right now, so this decade is halfway over, and it's still flying by in terms of what we're seeing in terms of indie development, what's happening with the game industry.
Yeah, absolutely.
So we kind of skipped over this, but to kind of officially get all ball rolling for today, if you wouldn't mind, Heather, could you talk a little bit about kind of what your background is when it comes to game dev? And then after that, what is the pitch for Fish Fear Me?
So I have been an independent game developer for most of my adult life at this point. My first, I guess, breakout success for any degree of that was I made a few visual novels back in the 2010s. Notably, the Extreme 8 Punks Forever series is the one that people tend to talk about. So since that point, I've worked in a fair few number of genres. Most recently, I've been working a lot in the sort of roguelike, Vampire Survivors-like space, with Snake Farm in 2023, and now Fish Fear Me in 2025. Fish Fear Me, I call a fishing roguelike. It's a fishing Vampire Survivor style game where essentially you are in this giant lake and you fish up the monsters that you have to fight.
Hmm.
So you have this sort of push your luck mechanic where you determine exactly, well, almost exactly, you don't know what you're going to pull up, but you determine, how much you're going to try and get up at any given time, because there's a very strict time limit of you only have so many hours in the day, you only have so many days in the week. At the end of the week, a giant sea monster is going to kill you. Then you have $1 billion life debt that, you have to pay off eventually, but each fish is only worth like $1 or $2, so you really got to start hustling. Um, it's a lot of fun. I've been getting some very positive feedback from players, and a lot of players, so that's been nice.
And with like the bullet heaven genre particularly, this is something I recently posted a piece about, kind of taking a look back at Vampire Survivors and how it's still, despite being like the game that like blew up this whole subgenre, the one that still feels very like progressive in terms of its mechanics and design. So
Mm.
with Snake Farm and Fish Fear Me, I guess like what did you like take away from like Vampire Survivors or like other bullet heavens when designing your own?
In order to properly work within a genre, you have to pay respect to the people who made it, Like, at the end of the day, I do say everywhere this is a game based, like, inspired by Vampire Survivors, because they are, like, the originals. They are the one who made this genre what it is. When I take direct mechanical inspiration from them, I usually do try to put my own little twist on it. Like, one of the main differences between Vampire Survivors and Snake Farm and Fish Fear Me is that sort of push your luck mechanic of you determine
Mm-hmm.
exactly in Snake Farm and almost exactly in Fish Fear Me what you're going to be pulling up at any given point. Snake Farm, you're buying your enemies, and in Fish Fear Me, you're fishing them. I would say that a lot of the design space has been defined by Vampire Survivors already, which is why I find it interesting to sort of go off the beaten path a little bit.
Trying to do something different with like the bullet heaven design, that's something I think that escapes a lot of those that we've seen, who kind of like immediately rush out to put out their own take on Vampire Survivors when the game was released. It feels like 3-4 years. It's hard to tell now, considering how fast that genre blew up. But we saw, like, just like with any genre that blew up in the 2010s, from deck building roguelikes to kind of like Darkest Dungeon like, just a lot of licks that came out,
Mhm.
that a lot of developers just try to copy the game wholesale. Or maybe they would like slightly change like the theme or aesthetic. Instead of it being a, I don't know, like a mystery, maybe it's a cowboy game. Maybe instead of trains, it's planes, but it still has like almost like 90% the same DNA. So
Mhm.
with like Fish Fear Me and Snake Farm, I guess like, as you were like preparing these games, I'm sure obviously doing research with other bullet heavens, what was kind of like the big thing you wanted to kind of make sure was indicative of the genre? And what did you want to say, like, I do not want this in my game? Like, I don't want to have this exact element in it.
That's a really good question. So Fish Fear Me, in a lot of ways, is in conversation with the concept of meta progression, right? Like the thing that Vampire Survivors really pushed forward, which is okay, you have all these different upgrades that you can buy with the currency that you gain in the game, and you get that money, you put it towards the upgrades. Those are permanent upgrades across every character. And the thing that I didn't quite like about Vampire Survivors, which I know a lot of people do like, so this is a little bit of a controversial thing, is the fact that you can stop playing the game after a while.
Mm-hmm.
Like there comes a point where the game becomes so easy that there's no real challenge to it anymore. I wanted to try and make a game that is giving new challenges throughout the entire runtime, because it's giving you new areas to explore, new things that your current skill set can't entirely deal with, et cetera, et cetera. So the meta progression in Fish Fury, it is partially defined around like making certain things easier. Like you start with more money, you deal more damage, you have longer like radius for collecting things around you, et cetera, et cetera. But at the same time, you're also gaining new qualitative tools in addition to quantitative tools. Like, okay, here's a new system that lets you pick out lures, and now you have to go on a bunch of different quests to get all the lures up. And all the lures are different gameplay modifiers, and I'm not going to tell you what all of them necessarily do. Like, some of them do have secret effects that people have only started to really understand recently. The game's been out for 2 weeks, and I think most of the secrets have been found at this point, but not all of them. Not all of them have been written down yet. Um, so that's been a lot of fun to watch. In addition, you get farther on, you start to interact with these altars that have already been around the environment, but you've had no way to interact with them up to this point. And I think that increasing depth of interaction allows for a sort of interesting vacillation across the entire runtime where you're constantly back and like bouncing back and forth between this is really hard, this is really easy, this is really hard, this is really easy, just going back and forth as you master each step of the process. And until you say this is easy too many times and the game decides that you've had it too easy.
And the point about meta progression is a very interesting one because it's also very similar to that in the roguelite genre, where
Yeah.
there are a lot of games that you reach that point that the game just is kind of solved. Like, if you're a good enough player, you may not need 70 levels of stat upgrades. You may only need 10 or 15. Some people may only need like one or two. And then
Yeah.
oftentimes, like, there's nothing else to do. Like, I see this again with a lot of the bullet heavens, where one of the biggest kind of walls you hit is the amount of damage you do. Quicker you kill enemies, they can't swarm you, which means you don't die. So bump up that attack stat high enough, and you can just stand still, and everything just like melts around you. And it's like, yay, that's great. Do I want to do this 87 more times? And in a lot of cases, it doesn't work that way. And before I talk about some of my favorites that have like kind of bulked that trend, I guess for you, Heather, any like bullet heavens, VS, like however you want to call them, that really stood out to you in terms of some that you enjoyed over the last few years?
So let's see. Obviously, Vampire Survivors is a huge inspiration. I would also want to shout out 20 Minutes Till Dawn, which was a huge inspiration, especially on Snake Farm with the addition of the twin stick shooter. I think. Let me look at my Steam list to see if there's. I'm sure there are others. The thing is, I don't actually play that many video games. I mostly just make them. I'm not sure if Nova Drift would technically count, but I have been enjoying it a lot, and I have been really taking inspiration from it for figuring out the control scheme for Fish Fear Me. It's really hard to make a game with tank controls that feels good. I'd like to think that I've done the best possible version of it, but there are always going to be some people who aren't satisfied.
And I guess like for me, like two of my favorites, kind of like really like don't play like traditional bullet heavens. One was Picayune Dreams, which came out I think it was last year, or the year before, which is kind of like a bullet hell, bullet heaven. It was like had a lot of shmup elements to it. And then
that's fun.
Yeah, and it was also very difficult as well. Like, I think this was again like one of the things I liked about in terms of meta progression was yes, the meta progression gives you more stuff. The game is still hard as hell. Like, you're not going to be relaxing in that one, no matter how much you upgrade. And one of the things I've been liking has been this kind of like more like integration of Diablo elements. So there's what was it, Halls of Torment and Death Must Die. I think Halls of Torment came out last year. Death Must Die was still, I think it's still in early access. But it's kind of like weird when I look at a lot of the bullet heavens because, like for myself, like besides those games, like I still enjoy Vampire Survivors, and you would think that after like 3 or even more years of that game, that it would have gone stale by now. But it still feels like very solid to play.
Yeah, I mean, I think that comes down to a few different elements. It's the fact that they just made a really fucking good game.
Yeah.
Like at the end of the day, everybody's copying from them because they did a really good job. The other thing is that they are still updating the game to this day. Like, the most important quality for these games is always the question of what's next. What do I do next? And I've done my best to, make that happen in Fish Fear Me. Like, up until like there's even a decent post game with killing the final boss with each of the different boats, and then some of them are especially challenging. But like you do have to give players that answer to the question of what's next. What is the thing that I am trying to do next? And the more answers you give to that question and the more they feel like they can achieve those goals, the better they're going to feel. Like, my favorite part of Vampire Survivors is the adventures, where they essentially just reset all of your meta progression and let you do it all over again in a limited capacity. Because that's the thing that I enjoyed most, those first few hours of the game where it's actually kind of difficult. You really have to focus on movement.
Yeah, and I think like one like the big things like for me, I'm you're interested in what you think about this point. One like the biggest like killers for me from a lot of the Bullet Heavens I've played is they always start out very slow compared to
Mm,
Vampire Survivors. Even something like Potato and 20 Minutes Till Dawn, where your very
mm.
first run, it just feels awful to play. Like your character moves like this fast across the map, and maybe you'll shoot a bullet once every 7 seconds, and
Mhm.
it just doesn't feel right to play. Especially again when you look back at Vampire Survivors, where within like 20 seconds you're already killing dozens of guys, with flashy effects all over the screen.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. And that first run is honestly one of the hardest things to balance because you have to make it
Yep.
fun. But if you make it too good, then players just don't have anywhere to go from it. Like if you start somebody off on like run 100 of Vampire Survivors without any build up, they're going to be completely overwhelmed. And everything from that point forward is just going to leave them nonplussed.
hmm And conversely, that's also why we see from a lot of Bullet Heaven developers that they'll make like the first like meta progression. It takes forever in terms of in-game time to actually get it. Like you may finish the run with, hey, you get 2 points, but your first order may be like 20 points. And then the
Mm,
player just feels like it didn't feel good in the first run. You want me to do like 5, 10 more runs, and then it starts to feel good? A lot of people just be like,
yeah.
nope, I'm out.
Yeah, this is something that I thought a lot about with Fish Fear Me. Like the first run, I am still figuring out the exact balance of a little bit, to be honest, even though the game's been out for 2 weeks. But the second run, I have that down pat because no matter what, even if you achieved nothing on the first run, you are guaranteed to almost definitely unlock a. No, you are guaranteed to unlock at least one new weapon if you completed the tutorial. And also, you are given the first meta progression unlock, even if you didn't catch any fish at all.
Mhm.
Uh, just by virtue of the fact that if you don't have any of the currency, the game will give you one piece of currency, which is enough to buy the first upgrade. Um,
Mhm.
and that, is the thing that lets you actually engage with the rest of the game. It's the bounty board, is what it's called. Essentially, various fish on each given day will be worth 3 times as much and give you the meta progression currency, which I tend to call forbidden knowledge.
Mhm.
Um, and because of that, what we're doing is giving players the engine that they need to start building out the rest of the run.
Mhm.
By the time that most players who are actually like decent at the game or just trying decently hard have finished their first run, they usually unlocked 3 to 5 weapons, a new boat, and probably like 2 or 3 meta progression upgrades.
And I guess as a follow-up question for you, Heather, regarding like meta progression for Fish Fear Me and Snake Farm, as we were saying a
Mhm.
few minutes ago, like you want to avoid just like the endless power trip or power gain of you're just going to keep getting more and more damage, more and more health, and then you just roll over everything. So for Fish Fear Me, like what are some examples of some like the meta upgrades or meta progression that you have in the game?
So some of the upgrades, starting at the very basic level, you have stuff like start with +3 health per rank. Health is relatively scarce. Most boats start somewhere between 5 and 15 health. And if you max out that one, which I think costs like 200 points of the in-game currency, um, the meta progression currency, there's no monetary transactions, but that gives you an extra +15 health. So that's effectively somewhere between doubling and quadrupling the amount of health that's currently available to you. Then further down the line, you have stuff like starting with a little bit more money, which allows you to buy more bait at the very beginning, which lets you start hunting the stronger fish more quickly. Um, or stuff like getting more rerolls in the shop, or there's one that's the most expensive item in the game called Absolute Violence, which just doubles all of your projectiles forever. So it's sort of like the duplicator ring for Vampire Survivors, but even more extreme.
And I think it's always important. Like this is something that I think about when I had my chat with Emma McMillan about Binding of Isaac. That you want to have like upgrades that kind of move things forward, but it's also gonna have like very like spiky upgrades, like something that just
Oh, totally.
really like changes what you're doing. I think for a lot of the games that I play, I rather have like 10 like very spicy upgrades versus like here's 750, you get plus 0.0065 percent movement speed. Upgrade that a few more times before you actually feel something.
Yeah, like that spikiness is something that I really aspire to, both in the meta progression upgrades and also in the weapons that are available to the player.
Yeah.
Like I like something that I like to say a lot is that a game is a series of pranks. I like giving Faustian bargains to players in ways that like they know exactly what they are doing if they read it, but then they actually try it out and they realize that they want anything else than the thing that they have now committed their entire run to. Like one of the upgrades that's available from the very beginning is the anchor, which just ties a giant anchor to your boat. And it's a giant physics object, and it weighs more than your boat, and it will throw you every single direction except where you're actually trying to go. And I just think that's really funny. And the more that you upgrade the anchor, the heavier it gets. And I don't know, that's something that I think is kind of delightful. Like every item in the game is something that is chunky enough that you immediately feel it and you immediately know how it could fit into a larger build.
Mm-hmm. I think that also goes with what we were talking about a few minutes ago with a 20 Missile Dawn. That also had that kind of, you had the spikiness with the different weapons, and then you had the different upgrade paths for each one of those passives. So it goes from, hey, you can shoot an ice bullet. Now freeze does more damage. Now freeze, shatters enemies and they send out ice shards that freeze additional enemies. Now ice shards that freeze and explode give you additional damage. And then like about like 10 to 15 minutes into the run, it's just like shoot one bullet, entire like explosion of ice all over the screen.
Yeah.
To bring this into everything that we've said, like it's like that kind of thing that one, I think is very indicative of what people like about like the bullet heaven, like the engine. They like to see that kind of progression. But it's also really great in terms of roguelike and roguelike design that you want the player, and I've used this line before when I talk with a lot of like roguelike developers, the consumer or the gamer loves to feel like they've gotten one over on the developer. That, I found that perfect combination of items and perks and weapons that completely breaks your game, and I'm sure you never thought of it. Of course, the developer knows exactly what it is because they put it in.
Yeah, that is absolutely it. Like, I love like the thing that makes roguelikes work is you give players a set of systems and you tell them how those systems work. And then they figure out the logical conclusions to those systems that you don't explicitly say, and they feel like a genius for figuring it out.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And you have to like think about your game along those lines. I guess here's another question I want to ask you, Heather, because whenever we talk about roguelike and roguelike design, another challenge that I see from designers is how far they want to push that power curve or that insanity engine of just more and more. Like to return again to when I chatted with Emmett Millen about Biomice, because I found it to be such a quintessential example of kind of action roguelike design. He did not care about balance. If you want to have, triple shot, penta shot, 10 times shot, and then just like shoot 87 million bullets on screen, go nuts. But there have been some developers who try to rein that in. They'll say, okay, only the, highest damaging modifier will count. Or you can only shoot at most 4 bullets. And there's, I think, that kind of push and pull between how much power you want, the player to feel, and trying to keep some semblance of balance. So I just want to get your thoughts on this, like designing bullet heavens, and with the bullet heaven genre being a genre that is about like that consistent escalation. Like, what are your thoughts on that?
I feel like balance has its place, as does imbalance.
Mm-hmm.
Like, the thing that people love about Vampire Survivors is the part where it has completely lost its balance and you are doing a million damage and everything is just melting around you and you haven't touched the controller in 10 minutes. People love that feeling, and they do it, and they do rightfully so.
Mm-hmm.
My approach to balance is to give the player the tools they need to screw themselves over. Like the big mechanic in Snake Farm and Fish Fear Me is that push your luck mechanic, where there are going to be some enemies that are always going to be difficult to defeat.
Hmm.
Like there are always going to be ultra rare fish. There's always going to be boss snakes, etc., etc. And unless you have absolutely optimized everything, they're going to be a little bit of a challenge. Like the big limiter for Fish Fear Me is the fact that you can only have 8 items at a time. Um, and those items can all be upgraded, up to 6 levels. So there's a decent amount of variance in what those items do. Uh, but no matter what, you are still going to have to try in order to, say, defeat the final boss. Um, but of course, obliterating that balance is also part of the fun. So I'm sure as I put out more content updates, as I give the players more tools, they're going to find ways to absolutely break things.
Hmm.
One of my favorite things that has been happening recently is my player base has come up with a build that they've called the Lag Bomb, which is combining the items Ichthyomancy, Cursed Crown, and Summoning Ritual, which essentially means that you have 1 HP forever. Well, it doesn't mean that as of today because I changed what Cursed Crown does, but you put yourself at a major disadvantage health wise, but you are able to summon a genuine army of skeletons to fight for you. And I'm also glad to say that as of today, the lag bomb is no longer a lag bomb. I've been working with an incredibly talented programmer, Noah Sharon, who has been visiting the project and making, like, undoing all of my optimization mistakes.
It's always good to have, like, as we were saying a minute ago about having like very spiky builds. Like when
Yes.
I think about like roguelike design in particular, I always like glass cannon style heavy debuffs. Like for me, like the one kind of like build I just can never get into are the like consume everything, like the X plus cards, stuff like that, like from Slay the Spire. But I
Mhm.
also have like runs where it's like you go down to 1 health, but you do 700% more damage.
Mhm.
Survive, but if anything sneezes on you, you're dead.
I mean, the only health point that matters is the last one, right?
True. Health is just a resource at the end of the day.
Yeah.
One thing that I want to ask you about specifically when it comes to Bullet Heavens before I forget is
Mhm.
kind of marketing the game. Because this is something that for many indie developers, and we spoke about this kind of at the beginning of this cast, that they tend to struggle with when it comes to getting their game out, how they market, how much do they market, etc., etc. And
Mhm.
with Bullet Heavens in particular, this is a very kind of tricky genre to work in because, as we've said, every and any game is obviously going to be compared to Vampire Survivors. That's just the nature of it. Just
Mhm.
like every deck builder is compared to Slay the Spire, every, like brutally difficult game is going to be mentioned as in the same vein as Darkest Dungeon or FTL. So
Mhm.
when I look on the store page for Fish Fear Me, you describe this as a top-down action roguelite. Like there's no
Mhm.
mention of, Bullet Heaven, Vampire Survivors, anything like that in the tagline. So I want to ask you, like, how did you approach like marketing this game, especially again considering how many of the genre are out there right now?
So I do want to note if you scroll down a little bit to the about this game section,
Mm-hmm.
the very first sentence is Fish Fury
Yeah.
is a top-down vampire survivor style roguelite.
Mm-hmm.
So like I do mention the full genre, but marketing is an interesting question. I always recommend people go to the website howtomarketagame.com. There's an excellent blog there that talks about a lot of different marketing techniques and how they work for indie games. Um, a lot of the things that I've used in order to learn how to, mess with the Steam algorithm a little bit, sort of came from that website. Uh, I would say a lot of it just comes down to being able to put yourself out there and being able to give yourself enough of a reputation that people want to see what you're doing.
Mm-hmm.
Like I've been making indie games for uh, almost a decade now, and a lot of that has come with a lot of people, hearing my name and knowing that it's me, and being willing to go out on a limb for maybe a genre they don't necessarily play often because they know that I'm the one doing it. Um, Now, the fact that the game was a sequel also definitely helped a lot because I was able to.
Mm-hmm.
Well, nothing on the game page says that it's a sequel, but a bunch of the stuff on the Snake Farm page says that it is one. Because if you market a game as a sequel, everybody's going to assume that they missed out on something on the original and they're not going to buy either game. That's a lesson that I learned the hard way. Uh, but because of that, and because I was able to let the game, be in Next Fest, a lot of my marketing technique involved annoying streamers into playing the video game. Like when Next Fest came out, I emailed everybody like 4 different times. Um, and then when the game came out, I emailed everybody twice again. And yeah, as a result of that, I got some decently big names playing the game, which means that I got some huge spikes in the wish list, which was especially useful, in the weeks before launch, because that's, how Steam determines who's going to get the attention that they
Yep.
need.
Mm-hmm. And as a follow-up question for you, as you said, like Fish for Me was not in the most recent Next Fest, which would be February for those of you listening. Those in the one prior. So how did it do, or like how did you like respond with marketing for that Next Fest for the game?
So I think it was actually 2 Next Fests
Okay.
ago. I did a bad job in estimating when the game would be released.
Mm-hmm.
I had, some personal stuff going on at the time. The game release got pushed back several months. I had assumed that I would get it out before the December Next Fest, but you know, development never goes quite how you want it to. But Next Fest, I would say, was a huge boon. I think it approximately doubled my wish lists. I was going in with around 1,500 wish lists and exited with around 3,000, I think. The game ended up launching with about 4,500 wish lists, and now it's sitting at somewhere around 25,000.
Nice.
Um, so I would say my biggest mistake with Next Fest was putting the game out, or like putting the game demo out on the first day of Next Fest. Everything that I've heard, apparently, which I heard after the fact, says that you should definitely put your demo out at least a couple weeks in advance so that you have time to, sort of take up your own space, get the game in its most polished state, and then,
Mm.
show it off to people once you have that sort of momentum behind it. I didn't follow this advice. It still turned out decently. Like doubling your wish list is a pretty good deal, I would say.
And yeah, like to that point, that's something that I see a lot with the indie demos. Because again, like I've covered at least 100 to 120 demos each Next Fest, and there's a very wide spectrum in terms of quality and polish. And we're not even just talking about like finished versus unfinished. We're talking about what feels like the very first alpha build of a game with like all the placeholder UI elements and all that versus a demo that looks like it has a complete beginning, middle, and end. And
Mhm.
as we've said several times throughout this cast, you only are allowed as an indie developer one shot in Next Fest. Like they will not
Yeah.
take the same game, for each and every Next Fest. So it is very important to make sure that first demo is as strong as it can be. Because
Yeah.
I've
This
seen
is
a yep, go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say this is an interesting thing about Steam, and I'm still not certain how I feel about it, which is they give you so many specific opportunities over the course of a game's like pre-launch lifecycle in order to, get more wish lists, get more people looking at your game, get more people following your store page, et cetera, et cetera. And you have to take the maximum advantage of each and every one of those. Like
Yep.
you only get one demo launch, you only get one Next Fest, you only get one pre-launch cycle, you only
Mm-hmm.
get one like launch period, et cetera, et cetera. And in order to succeed, or at the very least, in order to not fall behind the competition, you need to be taking advantage of each and every one of those, which, a lot of the stuff isn't really written down anymore. You just sort of have to, you know, get a feel for what might be happening.
Yep, and like as another big point about that, the rules have changed so much over the past 15 years as to
Yeah.
how Steam markets games, what programs are available. Again, like for the older developers listening, they all probably remember something like Steam Greenlight
Mm,
and how that was kind of like the major strategy to get your game onto Steam. Today, it's basically give them $100 and here's a store page. But
mhm,
I've said this plenty of times over. Like, while Valve gives you all these tools, they're not doing the job for you. And
mhm,
I think a lot of indie developers and like first time developers struggle with that fact that yes, Steam is this very wide and open platform, but they do not give it any two nickels about whether or not your game succeeds or fails. they'll take your money. They'll be happy to do that, but they're not going to do any work for you. And
Mhm.
I think the whole kind of rise of like the festival strategy over the last like 4 years has been very much indicative of that. If you put out a really good demo, if you kind of do the legwork, these festivals are a very great way to get your game in front of a lot of eyes. But if you don't do that, or you think I'm just going to put up the very first build of my game and 20,000 people wishlist it, it's not going to work.
Yeah. Like at the end of the day, the algorithm is a force multiplier,
Yep.
but they're not going to do anything for you for free, which sucks. Honestly, I
Yep.
really wish that Steam did more for developers other than just, you know, hey, here's your platform. If your game is already successful, then we'll, push it in front of more
Yep.
people so that we can make more money. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
but that's a much larger conversation than what we're talking about.
Mm-hmm. I guess to bring this back to like Bullet Heavens in particular, as we've been saying over this conversation, there's been so many of them being released that it's very hard A to keep track of them all, and B to kind of see what makes them special. And to that point, another thing I want to ask you about the kind of aesthetics of the genre. Because one of the things that we've seen kind of following the rise of Vampire Survivors, I've seen numerous indie developers try to go with like a very like I guess like high def or high res. They'll go to Unreal Engine, they'll make things like super, shiny and bright. And a lot of those games just end up feeling very hollow to me. And I just want to get you like your thoughts on like that particular point in terms of like I guess like the look and feel when it comes to the genre.
Something that's worth acknowledging is the fact that Vampire Survivors originally, like, and I might be incorrect on this. I don't entirely remember. I haven't like watched a documentary on it or anything, but it originally was an asset.
Mm-hmm.
Like it was made with a set of assets that the developer had, I believe, bought online. Um, and that I think speaks to the ingenuity of the genre. Like
Mm-hmm.
it's a genre where if you have a good idea, if you know what you're doing, you can make anything out of nothing. Like I have found a decent amount of success with Fish Fear Me, where almost every piece of art in the game is drawn by me, and I am not a good artist. Like I have had people complain about the graphics being made in MS Paint, but then they continue playing afterwards.
Mm-hmm.
Like I think graphics are definitely not the most important part of the genre. I think good graphics can be good. Don't get me wrong. Like there's a vampire themed one that came out a while back that I almost wanted to call Vampire Survivors, but I know that's not the name of it because that's the name of a game that already exists. But there was like a first person shooter where you had like 10 guns in your hands. I don't entirely remember its name, but that game was gorgeous, like very solid aesthetic. Um, and I think that absolutely worked for it. Like, I don't think good graphics are a downgrade by any means. But I think at the end of the day, what people pay attention to is the design.
Like for this particular genre, you really, as we've said, like it has to start off feeling fantastic. You can't
Mm,
tell someone, oh, it will get better after 20 runs or after you unlock this one upgrade. And
mm.
in terms of like it's like the general like speed or pacing, like with Fish Fear Me, how like what did you do? I guess like playtesting wise or kind of iteration wise to like make sure like it feels good to play.
So I did a ton of playtesting with this game. There is a Discord server that I have been running a lot of beta tests in over the past few months. I started really in the end of December, and I've just sort of been working with them since then. It was originally a Discord community for speedrunning Snake Farm, which it still does do that, but I have been sort of commandeering it slightly to also run beta tests. And as a result, it is full of people who really enjoyed the first game in the series and got really, really good at breaking it. And they get to like run around in this new version of the game and just break everything all over again. And they have a great time doing it. So I had players who were like drawing maps of the uncharted areas and like figuring out new broken item combinations and figuring out glitches that I had no idea were even there. And I think that's a real delight for this kind of game, to see players like actually focus on solving the puzzles that you put in that you didn't really think anybody would care enough to solve. And so I think I got a lot of experience with the mid and late game with that. And then for the early game, I just put the game in the hands of a lot of people who, didn't know as much about it, or like were just at a local game dev event or something like that, and just watched them play and see what they stuck with and see what they didn't stick with. I've had playtesters, sit down, say, I'm going to play one run, and then, play for 40 minutes straight, which I always think is fun to watch.
In terms of the feel itself, like with all the playtesting that you've done, I'm sure there are developers listening to this who are wondering this. Any like advice or lessons learned in terms of making like the general movement or combat feel good for the genre?
Don't make a game with tank controls. I did it. I think I did the best possible version of it. Everybody's hating it like everybody hates it regardless. It's simply the way of the world. Um, it's it's how boats work. I can't really change it. It wouldn't make sense with any other control scheme, but I do wonder sometimes if I had chosen something with a little bit more of an approachable control scheme, whether, you know, what other things people would complain about instead.
Mm-hmm. And that is a conversation in of itself in terms of when you have like a very specific control scheme that's kind of like integral or, the foundation of your game, what happens when people don't like it? Do you change the entire game? Do you kind of just, put your head down and just push through it? There's pros and cons of both.
Yeah, I found that my general response, which I believe to be fairly productive, is to provide options to keep the control scheme that I personally think is the best possible way of enjoying it, but also provide alternatives that are, more approachable on a broad level. Like I had this conversation with the fishing mini game recently as well, where a lot of people were sort of complaining about the fact that they had to be fishing a lot during the fishing game that has fish in the title. And so I made a new version of it that lets you, have the fishing mini game be automatic, and I put that in the options menu. And everybody said, "This is great. This is like a million times better." And so I said, "Okay." And now that's the default. But the other one is still in the options menu as the classic fishing game if anybody wants to play with that.
Since we are coming up on time, there's one last, I guess, like quick series of questions I want to ask you other, and then we'll wrap things up. So we spoke a lot about developing Fish Fear Me. We spoke about a lot of the feel and the design, and we kind of touched on future development or future things to be added. So I guess the last series of questions I have for you for tonight would be, how do you approach supporting a game like this? To again go back to something like Vampire Survivors, they approach things by just saying, here's more of everything. Here's more maps, more characters, more meta progression. We're just going to keep adding and adding and adding on. Some developers went with like a very more restrained approach. Like if we look at something like a Potato, they did like a few updates, and then when the game came out, like, okay, we'll do a DLC maybe 6 months to a year, and that's it. So what's your approach to kind of post-game support?
So my approach to post-game support is that it's a conversation with your player base, right? Like you have to be able to listen to what they are asking for and also what they're complaining about, and figure out how to answer those questions in a way that doesn't compromise your essential vision of the game. Like for Snake Farm, I put out 2 expansions for it, the Curse of Ramona and Economies of Scale. And after those were done, I realized that's the entire possibility space right there. I have filled out every possible mechanic that this game could have. I could make new mechanics, but then that's just a different game. So that's the last major update that I'm ever going to push out. And for Fish Fear Me, so I've been working a lot with, the community over the past couple weeks, being like, okay, well, here's all the bugs that we found. Here's all the spots that cause lag spikes. Here's some of the like UX wish list items that we want. And I've been trying to fulfill those while also slowly building out the next major content expansion. I only do free content expansions. partly because it's a good way to build player goodwill, and partly because I don't want to figure out how Steam's DLC system works. So the content expansion that I'm currently working on is called Women Want Me. As you know, women want me, fish fear me. That's the whole gag. Um, and it's about the fisherman, who's sort of our player character, being hunted down by the Lady of the Lake. And I'm estimating very roughly that it's going to take somewhere between a couple to a few months to complete, depending on various life circumstances, etc. But I know that this is a game that supports there being more of it, right? Like, the more that I add, the more that it just all clicks together. There are more things to do, which means that there are more things to try, which means that there are more puzzles to solve, and it's just a better experience overall.
And in terms of like having the conversation with your fan base or the community about what they want to see added, what you can do, what you can't do, how do you kind of like, I guess, prioritize? This is something that, definitely I want to put this in the next version of the game, or at least as free content, versus, yeah, it's nice to have, but, it could either be out of scope, or it just wouldn't be enough to kind of like justify the additional development.
I think that really just comes down to whether it passes the sniff test or not. I also have a wonderful community manager. Her name is Hearth. She's the one who sort of like does all the collating of the bug reports and the suggestions and sort of puts them in a document for me. And then I just sort of look through that document and I go, okay, that's a bug. I need to fix that. That's a bug. I need to fix that. That's not a bug, but it implies that you are misunderstanding a core mechanic, which means that I need to change that wording. That's an unreasonable feature request that might be part of the expansion. That is a feature request that I cannot do, etc. That's a feature request that I can do. So I think it's just sort of figuring out what falls where on the priority list. Like, ideally, I do want to get to everything, or at least have a solid reason why I'm doing something. And it really just comes down to whether I will be allowed the time and budget in order to make it happen, which as of now I have been.
And I guess like one final question for me then, for at least right now. Another challenge of not just of the genre, but just of indie development in general when it comes to post-game or post-release support is knowing when to stop, or how much do you want to add into this game before you're just like, okay, maybe I could just work on something else. So with something like Bullet Heavens in particular, again, as we saw with Vampire Survivors, there's an almost like infinite amount of content. There's always another map, there's always another item or another enemy or whatever you can put into it. So from your own perspective, how do you decide, or when do you decide that, okay, I think we've hit enough for this game?
That's a really good question. For Snake Farm, like I said, it came when I realized I had filled out the possibility space entirely. Like, the game has a very few set of core verbs. I realized I was just running out of ideas for things to do with those verbs in it. For Fish Fear Me, it has a much bigger possibility space, and like, to be perfectly frank, a bigger player base. So I think the question is going to come down to how long will I be able to work on this before it would become more, what's the word? Useful for me to be working on something else instead. And I have the hope that I will be able to keep working on this game for a long time. Like, I enjoy working on it. I have other ideas, don't get me wrong. I'm always coming up with new ideas. I had one a couple days ago that I'm still kind of chewing on. But it really comes down to which ideas are worth pursuing. And right now I have a lot of ideas for Fish Fear Me. I have at least 3 expansions in my head already. Whether I'll be able to get to all of them, time will tell, but I hope so.
And I think that is a really good approach to have when, like, you kind of like compartmentalize like what kind of updates or features you want to have. Because we've seen some developers go with the, I'm just going to take every single one of my ideas, I'm just going to make that into new DLC. And that can lead to the game becoming more and more chaotic. While some developers go for, okay, like to go back to the DLC point, they'll say, okay, we're going to release 5 chunks of DLC. This chunk will include, I don't know, the forest biome. This chunk is new bosses. This chunk is new weapons, etc. And then they'll just leave it like that. But it is important. I think there's something to, and this is a larger topic we do not have the time to get to today, but I think it's very important as a developer to kind of think about your game in terms of long term and just like how much you are willing to kind of keep putting into it before, again, it just kind of spirals out of control.
Yeah, like a game is, in a sense, an ecosystem, and you want to put things into it not just because it's new material, but because you think it will ultimately improve it. Like you do have to prune some ideas because they would be
Yep.
ultimately harmful to the experience of the game, like much farther down the line.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And it's again to go back to that point about meta progression really fast. Like if you add too much of it, and your game just becomes this like unnavigable. Wow, you can't navigate in. Let's say like that. It
Mhm.
ends up making the game just feel very convoluted to the player. And
Mhm.
it's very hard, I think. I don't think a lot of developers have gotten this down right to say we can add, 87 new weapons, 700 new enemies, 400 new maps, and make it still all feel as consistent and solid as it did on, day one, patch one, DLC one.
Mhm. Yeah, absolutely.
All right. So we are coming up on time. So before we do our kind of end of cast wrap, anything else regarding Fish Fear Me, Snake Farm, Bullet Heavens, whatever that we didn't discuss that you would like to bring up?
Play the game, I hope. Like I don't know. I would like to say that the work speaks for itself. I know that it doesn't always. Sometimes I do have to do the speaking for it. Um, I have been doing this for a long time, and I hope to continue doing it for a very long time. And I'm very excited to continue making expansions for it. For some reason, I just have really big DLC brain. Like I got into this when with Snake Harm as well. I am happiest in my work life when I am making expansions to pre-existing games. I do not know why. I just am.
So I guess as a follow up to that, I gotta ask then: have you given any thought as to what your next project will be, or are you still in a Fish Fear Me mode?
I have. I'm currently chewing on. This is a very early concept, so it's a work in progress. A sort of Pikmin themed roguelike. Uh, it's got a lot of little bits that I'm still working on. I think it might be gnome themed.
All right, I'm a Pikmin fan, so I'll look forward to that one.
Nice.
All right, so we are about at time, Heather. Again, it has been a pleasure hanging out with you this Friday evening. So, to wrap things up, for people listening to us, so as of we are recording this again, like early March, Fish for Me came out at the end of February. It's currently available on Steam. Are you planning on releasing on any other platforms?
Not at present, no.
Okay. And for people listening who want to follow you or anything like that, do you have any social media you like to plug? Twitter, Blue Sky, X, whatever.
I do not. My mental health is through the roof ever since I quit social media.
That is definitely a positive right there. I may have to look into that one myself.
Yeah.
All
Turns out you
right.
don't need posting.
Yeah. All right. So, any other final points any you'd like to mention before we say goodnight?
Um, Not especially. Thank you for talking with me. This has been an absolute delight.
hmm I love having these conversations. These are some of my favorite parts of covering the game industry.
Mhm.
So, Heather, again, thank you so much for coming on. Best of luck with the kind of post release of Fish Fear Me and the Pigman game and whatever else you have next.
Yeah, thank you.
All right, not a problem. So, for those of you listening, we're going to wrap up our conversation for tonight. Again, if you are a developer or wanting to chat about your game, game dev, or anything else, please get in touch. For those of you who watch us on YouTube, do all the YouTubing stuff, buy all the copies of my books. Maybe we get enough copies sold, I'll be convinced to write a book on Bullet Heavens and all that. But thank you again for tuning in, and come back for the discussions on game design here and on game wisdom, where you study the art and science of games. Until our next chat, have a great night.